Hello everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, uh, based on wherever you're joining from. I am Maha Salman and welcome to the first ever Policy Evaluation Fall School 2022. Today is the second day and this event is organized by Asia Pacific Evaluation Association in collaboration with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office, NITI Aayog. The communication is supported by Asia's Pacific Communication Hub. Hope you're all doing well. What an exciting day it was yesterday. And before we start day two, a couple of housekeeping rules. We would request you all to please keep your microphone and video disabled so that you can hear us well and you can see all the speakers as well. And as we've mentioned before, please rename if you haven't done it yet. So please rename your Zoom name to participant code followed by first name and last name. This is for your attendance. So please use the codes and the names provided in the list. And just one small reminder that attendance will be marked by our team after a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for everybody to gather. So, and please stay on the link throughout for the 3 hours. And as you all know, we have always, yesterday also, we had a very, very interactive chat bar. And we will again be using the chat box for your comments, questions, suggestions. So yes, we're all looking forward to day two today, which is going to be about the DAC criteria, looking at the relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, the impact, the coherence, and the sustainability of our interventions. And for that, for the introduction of day two and for the recap of day one, I will invite Dr. Sanjeev Siridharan, the country lead learning systems and systems evaluation from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, India. So welcome, Dr. Sanjeev. The mic's yours.
Good day, everybody. Greetings from Washington, D.C., actually. Firstly, let me first congratulate Apia and as well as Maha for creating a really warm space for dialogue. I think when we thought about doing a policy evaluation school, there was a recognition that too often we are too mechanical in evaluation. We don't actually create spaces where we actually have a dialogue across many different contexts without too much hierarchies thrown in. And so I just want to say, I just felt my overwhelming sense of yesterday was there was a warm space of dialogue where there was honest discussion, and I think really critical key points emerging itself. So I think for me, such a dialogue is needed as somebody who has spent many years in North America and Europe, has returned back to India in the last few years. I think the need for South-South dialogue as well as North-South dialogue has never been greater in evaluation. And I think creating these kinds of spaces becomes critical. Key messages for me from yesterday. Yesterday was really a deep meditation on thinking about results and thinking about theories of change. So let me sort of call out some of the key messages. I'll actually go a little bit chronologically. For me, Shailendra Dwivedi, Joint Secretary from DMU, who got us started, I think he made a really critical point that, in a sense, we simply have to constantly remind ourselves, what does it mean to actually have evidence-based programming, evidence-based policies? How would somebody from a completely different planet who comes along and watches our claims of evidence-based policies, how will you actually know this is evidence-based? And what does it actually mean? Where's the proof that it actually improves lives? I think for me, Shailendra's initial presentation was also important because just a reminder that as evaluators, we are in the business of improving lives, of social betterment. It's not just about a single method. I think sometimes with evaluation, we end up creating divisions. I'm a realist evaluator, I'm an experimental evaluator, etc. I think we need to kind of remind ourselves, eventually we're in the business of improving lives. So I think for me, that was really a great start. I think Shweta Sharma, also from DMU, really sort of provided a wonderful and concise reflection on the importance of thinking about results, but once again, not in a mechanical way. She connected it to notions of theory. She also connected it to as evaluators, we have multiple purposes and different kinds of evaluations are required for the different purpose needed. So I think there was a really good connection. I think the other part of Shweta's presentation that I liked was it's almost never just about does an intervention work? For solving a problem, you've got to constantly be asking, so what's missing? What's next? And I think that really connects with also the next presenter, who I thought was one of the highlights of yesterday, Soma De Silva, talking about theories of change. I think Soma's presentation was, as I noted in the chat, one of the best presentations I've seen on theories of change. Her examples were stellar. She focused on maternal health. Uh, I really want people to know when you talk about theories of change, you're not being an academic, you're actually thinking in the most practical sense. And I think Soma did a wonderful job demonstrating nothing as practical as a good theory. She also talked about how we need to be thinking deeply about multiple causation when we think about programs. Our programs often address one or a couple of causes. How do we get more comprehensive in our thinking about theories of change? A friend of mine from the World Bank, Michael Woolcock, likes to say we're often in the business of selling solutions when we should be in the business of solving problems. When we work on problems like health inequities, like maternal health, remember, it's almost never just about our intervention. It's really about improving lives of people. I think that Soma really provided us a wonderful sort of, a comprehensive view of theories of change. Then we had a fantastic panel. Yamini sort of posed the question, and I think it was a very far-reaching panel just because of the range of different voices represented. I liked Yamini's question, a simple, innocent question. What does results mean to you? Fantastic set of answers. Madhu spoke about, it's not just about results, Madhu Ketan, but also about the dialogue and processes arrived at to arrive at those results. And I think it's important. It's not just a mechanical button you're switching. You're really kind of empowering people as you think about results. Josephine really echoed the same message. I liked her phrase, nothing about us without us. She speaks from a parliamentarian's point of view. I like that. I think it's really important that when we are evaluating programs intended to improve the lives of clients, we really hear clients' voices first before we actually get into the business of results. Tashi from Bhutan spoke about the importance of being inclusive. And I think for me, the lesson out there was to ensure the fact that we're not just sort of going with the usual few suspects in terms of the kinds of evaluations we commission, etc. Important lessons learned. I think Yashashwari, again from DMU, spoke about it's not just about results in a mechanical sense. It's about organizational learning and how do we actually set up learning systems. For me, Yashashwari's presentation was important because I constantly remind my colleagues, evaluation is not the same as learning. Evaluation is a part of learning. Under the right structures and processes, evaluations can lead to learning. So we're really well set up for today. Today, what I want you to reflect on your own intervention, reflect on the kinds of things you work on. Ask yourself, how do you know that your intervention is valuable? What's the basis of this itself? We have the initial presentation is going to be Megan from OECD, a real genuine leader in the field who really talks about OECD's approach to this. And I think the OECD has done a fantastic job in actually bringing a principled process of thinking about evaluation criteria. The important lesson you've got to learn is that in your own setting, these criteria might be useful, but you might have other criteria in mind. And I want to empower you to think about, for your community intervention, for your system level intervention, are there other criteria you have in mind to actually assess value? Then we move to Candice, so Kiran Crawley, who will sort of lead a session that hopefully will get a lot of your feedback on how would you go about ascertaining value after Megan's presentation. We end today with Candice Mockle, who sort of talk about different types of evaluations. It's super important for you to appreciate that as a field, we are incredibly dynamic. Somebody's told me about the almost 110 different evaluation approaches. Candice will tell you about a few different evaluation approaches. And I want you to appreciate that as a field, as a PIA and other organizations are in the field business, our field of evaluation itself is young. And I think it's a pretty exciting time to be an evaluator. With those initial comments, back to you, Maha.
you so much, Dr. Sanjeev. It was almost like, reliving yesterday's sessions. And you've given an introduction and what is expected in day two. We're going to have 3 sessions, and again, a stellar panel of speakers who are going to be giving the sessions today. So without further ado, I think we should move to the first session for today, which is on learning criteria, the relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, coherence, and sustainability. And for this session, I will invite Ms. Megan Kennedy Schuan. She is the head of evaluation unit, OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. Welcome, Megan. Hello, Ms. Megan. Might be a slight delay. Let me check with the productions team. Can someone in the production team please check? And while we're waiting, you all can basically share anything related to the OECD DAC criteria. So we don't expect you to know it already, but in case you know something about it, so please share your views in the chat box so we can utilize this time well.
I know Megan was joining us from a meeting, and she may be a couple of minutes late, so let's give her a couple of minutes.
Hello, I'm here now, Sanjeev. I apologize for being late.
Oh, no problem at all.
Megan.
Welcome.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Great. I'm sorry, there'll be a little bit of background noise just for a few moments, and then it should clear.
No worries.
So let me go ahead and share my screen. And welcome to the second day. I'll give about a 20-minute presentation. We will have a time to pause and ask questions. And we'll also have an opportunity for you all to reflect on some of the material I'm giving you and work it yourselves. So thank you so much for having me today. My name is Megan Kennedy Schuan, and I head the evaluation team at the OECD. The goal of the OECD is around better policies for better lives, and we work to support the evaluation of public policies within OECD governments, and also support our partners in strengthening their evaluation capacity. So today I'll be talking about the evaluation criteria, or just simply the criteria, as we like to call them, because their use is really important, not only for evaluation, but also beyond, as I'll be sharing. So I will give a quick introduction today to the criteria. What are they? How are they meant to be used? I will introduce you to an exercise that you will be going through as I present the rest of the material. Then I'll walk you through the 6 concepts and how they're defined. Now, this is a lot of quite dense material, so I will focus in on just a few of the criteria on coherence, impact, and sustainability. But you can find a lot more information on all of these concepts on our website, which is oe.cd/criteria, and there you can download a lot more information. So I will skip through some of it in a rather high-level way. And then at the end, we'll discuss a couple of common challenges and practical tips. And I just wanted to frame this in terms of your overall training for the 3 days, is to say that, you know, this session about the criteria is really just one piece of the evaluation picture, and that in the session later on today, you will be hearing more about how do you actually go about answering the questions that you would ask with these criteria in the methodologies discussion. So just to check with the colleagues, is the sound and everything fine? I'll continue.
Yes, go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Veronica. So in the spirit of telling you in advance what I'm going to tell you, let me describe a couple of the key takeaways today. So one is what are the criteria? The criteria describe what good looks like. So when we say this is a good policy, we mean that it's a policy that is effective, that is relevant, that is sustainable, etc. So you'll hear a little bit more about that and what the criteria are. We call that their normative role. The criteria are designed to help us ask the right questions. And that means by asking the right questions that we can have useful evaluations. And that's another really key point. Anyone can use these criteria, and they can use them when you're designing policies, programs, or projects. If you're monitoring or evaluating them, if you're making decisions, you can even use them at home with your own family if you want to be evaluating how things are going in your household. And the criteria should be adapted to the context and used thoughtfully. So when we say anyone can use them, that's really the spirit in which they are offered. We encourage people to use the criteria as and when they find them useful and adding value. And a key element of the new definitions that we have worked on in 2019 is that they're reflecting the current Agenda 2030 and issues around equity, by which we mean the power dynamics and variable outcomes for different people, and also issues around synergies and potential trade-offs. So those are important cross-cutting elements. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about the imperative of the current historical moment. And in this decade of action, what's sometimes called as the decade of action on Agenda 2030, accountability is everything. So we're way past the point where we need to focus on making commitments, particularly in regards to the existential climate crisis. So governments have been for decades making commitments about the need to reduce poverty, the need to address famine and hunger, the need to empower women, for example, and the need to take action on climate. And it's now too late for us to continue making promises. We need to take action. And so in that context, accountability is really important. And also we need to learn faster and better. We don't have time to waste money on things that don't work. Speed is critical. And as with any transformational change process, many of the policies or interventions that I might be evaluating have a high potential for having unintended effects. There's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of complex change processes into which we are working. So as evaluators, we need to keep that in mind. And we need to use evaluation as a tool to speak truth to power. That is the role of evaluation. We need to be courageous sometimes to speak truth and to pay attention to what is known. Who knows what, and how are they using that knowledge? Are we using knowledge? Are we acting on the knowledge that we have at our disposal? So what is public policy evaluation? Public policy evaluation, and this is coming from an OECD legal instrument that was agreed over the summer, the past couple of months, and it does outline the recommendations of the OECD on evaluating public policies. It refers to the structured and evidence-based assessment of the implementation and results of a planned, ongoing, or completed intervention. It assesses the relevance, coherence, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, or sustainability. Now, what I'd like to point out here is that these 6 criteria, relevance, coherence, efficiency, sustainability, are actually a core part of the concept of evaluation. They help us understand the role of evaluation. These are the questions we want to use evaluation to answer. As I said at the beginning, the criteria are, on the other hand, only one piece of the normative framework that helps guide evaluations. We also have evaluation principles, core principles such as impartiality, independence, credibility, and usefulness, also participation of stakeholders. And we have quality standards, which help define the processes through which we go about answering the questions and the products and the quality standards that we apply to evaluation reports themselves. So always keeping in mind that the criteria, as I said, are just one piece of the puzzle. What are the evaluation criteria? The criteria encourage us to look at effectiveness and results. So looking beyond inputs and activities, looking beyond level of effort or level of commitment to really say, what difference did we make? In that sense, the criteria are designed to support a critical thinking and to help us answer the right questions, ask the right questions, and then answer them. They themselves are not an evaluation approach, they're not a methodology, but they are could be considered as a lens, a way of understanding what good looks like. And they're best when they're used throughout the project cycle. So if at the beginning, during the design phase, or during the funding approval phase, if we ask these questions, is this intervention relevant? To whom is it relevant? Whose needs are being met? That's really important. So that's the role of the criteria. Why do the criteria matter? Here's a quote from an American novelist, who's Thomas Pynchon, who says, if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. Now, I think this is a really important point because it talks to the value, again, of speaking truth to power, of asking the right questions, sometimes the difficult questions, which is our role as evaluators. We've defined two principles for the use of the criteria. And it's really important to think not only about what the criteria are, but how they're used. And many of the problems that we've seen that partners or our members have flagged in terms of what challenges they face with the criteria have to do with how they're being applied. They should be applied thoughtfully in the context of a useful evaluation. And we often say, in some cases, it's better to do no evaluation at all than to do an evaluation that wastes time or doesn't add value. So in that sense, the criteria should be applied in a contextualized way. We may choose to cover the criteria according to the needs and according to the value of the relevant stakeholders, including the people who we're intending to reach with our findings and recommendations. So we're really not talking about the need to sort of have a checkbox exercise where you cover all 6 criteria, but rather that even though the criteria do apply to all interventions, to all public policies, we want to focus on our evaluation resources going to looking at the criteria that will add the most value and bring the most important learning to light. So now I'd like to turn to all of you in thinking about your own intervention. And I'd ask you actually, if you have in front of you a piece of paper or a notepad, please just go ahead and actually write this down, and you'll work on it throughout the next 10 minutes or so as I go through the criteria. What I'd like you to do is think about an intervention that you're either involved in or might want to evaluate, and write down the name of that project or intervention, and then write down its primary objective, just one objective that we can use as a basis for thinking through the criteria. And as I go through now each of these 6 criteria, try to take a moment to come up with 1 or 2 evaluative questions for each criteria. And if you'd like to, share your evaluation questions in the chat. And then that will allow us to sort of identify some of the challenges. Where was it more difficult for you to come up with the criteria? And we can continue those discussions with Kieran in the next session. So go ahead now and write the intervention that you want to keep in mind. Okay, so a couple of quick points on language. The first is that I'll use the term intervention. An intervention is being used to describe the object of the evaluation, the thing that we're evaluating. It could be a project, it could be a program or strategy or a thematic area. So try to think of it in a very general sense. And the intervention that you've written down will be the one you want to have in mind as I use the word intervention throughout the discussion. I also use the word beneficiary once in the definition of relevance, and this is used with a specific meaning. It's the individuals or organizations, whether targeted or not, that benefit from the intervention. Now, in many contexts, we might feel more comfortable using a different term, such as rights holders or affected people. And the question of whether or not the intended beneficiaries actually do benefit is, of course, a common question for evaluations to answer. So how do we think about these criteria? You'll see here an image of a school that's being operated by the International Red Cross Red Crescent Federation in Afghanistan. And I'll just use this image throughout the discussion as a way to illustrate the concept of the criteria. So we can think of each criteria as a lens or a filter. Each one of them gives us a slightly different perspective on the intervention. So we can imagine viewing this school through these different perspectives and asking different questions about the process and the results. So each of the questions that we might ask, what difference is this school making? What impact is it having on these children's lives? Will the benefits that they're gaining from the school be sustainable over time? How well does this intervention meet the specific rights and needs of the girls that are in this school? And how does it fit within the priorities for them and their families? And together, by looking at these 6 questions, we get a complete picture. So I'll now walk us through the 6 criteria. As I mentioned, I'll spend a little bit of time more on relevance, impact, and sustainability. And I encourage you to look at our website and get more information on the others. Sorry, I'll focus on coherence, impact, and sustainability. So relevance is the question, are we doing the right things? A couple of key points I want to flag on relevance is that the primary person who should be defining whether we're doing the right things are the impacted people, the people who are meant to benefit from the intervention itself. It's their needs and priorities that come first. And we also look at those priorities and needs of the country, of the partner institutions that are either funding or implementing the intervention. And there's also an element of time. So as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, circumstances change, priorities and needs shift. And so evaluators need to also look at the extent to which relevance is maintained as circumstances change. Coherence is one of the newest criteria that's now being widely used, and it looks at how well an intervention fits. So it's the compatibility of the intervention with other in a country, sector, or institution. And it's the extent to which interventions support or undermine one another. This can include both internal coherence, so say within a department of the Indian government, say within the Ministry of Education, or external coherence. So the extent to which the school that we're seeing here in Afghanistan is coherent with other policies in that community or in that region. Coherence also includes an element of international norms and standards to which the institution involved adhere. So in the case of a school for children, we could think about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the extent to which that international law is supported or undermined by a school or a particular education policy. Effectiveness is one of the core criteria of evaluations. It's about whether we're achieving what we set out to do. But what I'd like to flag up for you today is this element of differential results across groups. So we know that all interventions benefit different people and different communities in different ways. And it's important that this definition allows evaluators to ask those questions, even if addressing inequality or exclusion was not one of the objectives of the intervention. This is a really important sort of hook from which we can hang evaluation questions to look at differential impacts. Efficiency is about how well resources are used. Here we look at resources including human resources, as well as monetary resources, ecological resources, and how those are converted into outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Impact, speaking of impact, is about the difference that the intervention is making. It's what we call the so what question. It's what difference does this make at a higher level to a longer term change process or to the people that are directly impacted. It's the extent to which the intervention has generated not only the intended positive effects that it set out to, but also unintended effects, which could indeed be negative. We look at the ultimate significance, and that includes the transformational effects. So whether we're creating normative changes or systems changes that go beyond the immediate results of the intervention. And it does so by examining the holistic and enduring changes that most affect people's well-being and their human rights. Finally, sustainability. Will the benefits last? Sustainability is a relatively neglected criteria, so it's a really important one to look at. Here, we're not talking about continuing to sustain the intervention to keep doing the activity, but whether the benefits themselves will last. And we also recognize that there could be potential trade-offs between different types of sustainability. So for example, the fiscal sustainability of an intervention and its benefits versus the social acceptability. So I'd love to see if anyone has put their questions in the chat. Please do take a moment to think about, I see some of you have put in your interventions. Let's think now about any questions that you might come up with for how you would evaluate that intervention, whether that might be under relevance, under effectiveness, or under sustainability, any of the criteria. And as I mentioned, this discussion will continue into the next part of the day. So please do feel free to share any points in your chat. And I see we have a question here from Abu Bakr Mohammed, Dr. Moki. Yes, so it is true that impact could also be short, medium, or long term. It's not necessarily only the time dimension that makes impact really important. It's also the element of the significance of the impact that matters. So what we talk about here is higher level changes. So those could be, for example, life and death situation impacts. And those could indeed be short or medium or long term. It's a great question. Other questions here? So there's another question I see from Carlos about, are the criteria used in humanitarian settings? Indeed, they are. There are also 3 additional criteria that have been defined for use in humanitarian settings. And ALNAP, the Accountability and Learning Network for Humanitarian Practitioners, is currently working on a new guidance that will look at how these 6 criteria can be specifically applied to humanitarian action. And that will look in particular at how they interplay with key humanitarian principles, for example, of neutrality and other core humanitarian principles. And there's also a unique interpretation of some of the criteria. So sustainability, for example, might be thought of in a slightly different way in a humanitarian context. There's a question here from Sanjeev about the cultural dimension of coherence. Any examples that have connected coherence criteria to the cultural context? I'd love to hear, Sanjeev, if you want to come in with any thoughts that you have behind that question.
Well, I think both in India and in Canada, where I spent a fair bit of time, we work in indigenous communities. And often when we have evidence, this program has worked rather dramatically well in context 1 and context 2. I think spending a little time to make sure that whether this intervention fits in within the larger ecosystem. So I say this more in a kind of forward-looking focus itself too, as we sort of think about coherence. Clearly there's a sort of ecosystem nature to coherence, but there's also, there's a certain a cultural feel nature to it itself too, but it's not quite. And so, so one could argue it's not the right, you could sort of almost bring in the culture from a more relevance point of view, but I also felt that actually there's a coherence part of it. Actually, I'm not thought through the connections in this cultural setting. There are a couple of folks from Meghalaya here on the call, or in Northeast India, where we did a summer school about 2 months ago, where we didn't speak of it specifically about coherence, but the cultural dimension was really critical, because the whole idea that what might work in Delhi might not really be the right way to go in Northeast India, etc. So I think bringing that sort of thinking was also important. So, yeah. Not sure whether it really belongs in coherence, but I thought I'd raise it.
Yeah, I think it's an important one. And, recognizing that all human beings, we all have cultures, we all have places, and we all have individual characteristics as well. So I would actually say that the question of sort of cultural importance is throughout all 6 criteria, really. So how do you think about impact? What's the significance of the change? And something that one community might define as incredibly important, for example, impacting their land or forests, that might be considered a huge high-level impact in a certain community, and maybe in another culture or another community that's not particularly significant. So I think actually this question is really important, and it also brings to mind, Sanjeev, this question of sort of who gets to decide what's coherent or who gets to decide what's relevant. And that to me is a really important element. You know, it's not just asking, is it relevant, but it's also saying, oh, actually, there's a disagreement between the government partner sitting in his office in Delhi and the woman who's actually in the field in northern India, as you mentioned, who's being impacted. And her perspective might be very different.
And I think where I'm going with this is in the next few months, we would actually love these, like this Indian Institute for Public Health, Shillong, who's represented on this call, want them to actually develop course material that will actually try to put some teeth around their own. So I think the whole idea is to promote this kind of dialogue. And I threw that question just to sort of really say how sort of open-ended some of these really important topics are. And this is why I think a session like today really gives voice to very different people's experiences. Over.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I really encourage people. What I've found is that these criteria serve as a really interesting entry point to talking about what evaluation is in a very basic way. And so that's an excellent way to think about using them. I see there's some great questions in the chat about the use and the trade-offs between the different categories. And that actually leads right into the next element. So some of the common challenges that we see are around there being too many criteria. So you have 6 criteria. For each one, you have 2 or 3 questions, 4 or 5 questions. Sometimes you end up with 30 questions. And in my culture, we have a saying that's a mile wide and an inch deep. So you end up with an evaluation that's trying to answer a lot of questions, and none of them are answered very well. And none of them are really telling anybody something that they don't already know. That's a real challenge. Another is balancing, and in the next slide, I'll come back to some ideas for solutions for some of these, and that will also answer some of the questions in the chat. Another element is around this idea of flexibility versus comparability. So while we want to allow some freedom so that different interventions being evaluated in different ways by different people can apply the criteria in a way that makes most sense for them, that does lead to a challenge in comparability. So if we have, for example, a whole series of water-related interventions or water sector and hygiene interventions, we want to be able to understand if a project that's classified as a success in one community is actually as successful as the same intervention being applied in a different community. And if we have too much flexibility in how the criteria are applied, we can lose some of that comparability across interventions and evaluations. There's a lot of interlinkages between the criteria. And so that's another challenge, is to sort of how do we keep the conceptual clarity, but also look at interlinkages. And the guidance that we've developed on the criteria, which is available for free on our website, does look at these interlinkages. So for example, you can't look at efficiency until you've looked at effectiveness, right? So once you know what has been achieved in terms of outputs, outcomes, and impact, then you can look back at whether they were used effectively to achieve those, or whether there were any better alternatives. We also see the lack of knowledge or a lack of action. So I think there's often a push that we need more evaluations. Oh, the problem is we just don't know what works. But what I've actually seen is that many times we do know what works, or we at least know what doesn't work, and we're not taking into account that evidence from the very beginning. So this again relates back to the need to use the criteria throughout the program cycle. And then there's this issue of scoring and weighting. And I think somebody asked in the chat, how do you balance that? So if you did things perfectly, but you were doing the wrong things, so you were effective, but not relevant, would we consider that a success? If the circumstances changed, and so your objectives actually changed completely from when you first invented or developed the program, would we consider that a success? Or will the evaluator come in later and say, no, you didn't do what you said you were going to do, so you failed? These are all really challenging questions for evaluators, and it comes back to issues of fairness as well. Are we judging the partners involved in the intervention fairly, and are we using an evidence base that makes sense? And our German colleagues have a term that they call the knockout criteria. And that's kind of this idea that certain questions like relevance, if you don't get relevance, if you don't have a check on that criteria, really none of the other criteria matter very much. And so there are different ways of approaching how do you weight the criteria and how do you come to an overall conclusion. And just as I said, there's a lot more that can be said about different ideas for addressing these, but a couple that I would like to emphasize. One is really focusing on the value add. What do you need? Once, just looking now at your own list of questions, if you could only ask one question, which is the one that would add the most value? So really being focused, asking the most important questions that somebody needs to know that's going to really support learning and change. And where would you have the greatest potential to change behavior? To actually not just produce knowledge, but actually have that translate into a change that's going to improve somebody's life. And this maybe also comes back to this question of cultural relevance, which is to be a translator. In my experience, I've seen that the words, even the words, let's say in English, that's my native language, people might not use the word relevance, but a lot of times the things that they're talking about are questions of relevance. So it can be really helpful for an evaluator to listen and mirror back to people and help them translate what they're saying. And I often encourage people to use a different word. If relevance is not the word that resonates, use a different word. And whether that's in a different language or that's just using a different term, a different concept that resonates better, but it's getting at that concept, that's really important to make sure the evaluation is meaningful to the people who matter most. And I would also encourage people to provide more operational guidance. So these are very high level concepts, but in an individual institution, you can really bring it down and say, where should we focus? So for example, on coherence, which elements of coherence are we going to focus on most in our evaluations? Excuse me. And finally, if you do add different criteria, so for example, on climate mitigation, as I mentioned earlier, speed is of the essence. So some institutions have added speed of change, speed of impact as an additional separate criteria. If you do choose to add criteria, be sure that you define them and that you keep the concepts distinct so that it's clear which value add is that criteria bringing. And we have new work that's going now on human rights and gender equality and how to apply a human rights and gender equality approach to using these 6 criteria. And that's actually underway right now. So we'll be looking forward to talking with you all more about that once it's available. So I'll stop there. I know there are probably a lot more questions. I'd be happy to take a few questions if we have time. Here's the website that you can download the criteria. I did just want to mention that they are available in multiple languages. Here you can see all of the languages that they are currently available, including some Asia Pacific languages, but not all of them by any means. So if you are interested in producing a language in any of your national languages, please do feel free to reach out. We're happy to support partners in doing that translation process. And I also wanted to share just a glimpse of an example, which is the common framework of the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition. And you see here on the right our attempt to define 6 high-level questions to which all of our partners are now generating evidence, and that's supporting shared learning across the institutions. So let me know, Sanjeev, if you want me to take a bit more time or some more questions from the chat. And I see people are sharing, which is great. It's really fun to see all your different questions, and maybe we can help compile those.
I think we have time. We can take a few questions in the chat, and meanwhile you answer the questions. If somebody wants to share a case, which was the assignment that you gave, so if somebody wants to share their case, then you can raise the hand so that we can you can share it with us. So Megan, why don't you, since we have time, why don't you answer a couple of more questions that are there in the chat box?
Great, thank you. And yes, please do raise your hand if you'd like to share some more of your evaluation questions that you've come up with. We would love to hear from you. And let me just look back at the chat now and see which other questions. So there's one about, and yes, there's a question about how to contact us. So let me give you the email. I'll put that up in just a second. So one question is about how do you balance the judgment? Oh, now there's a lot of questions here. How do you balance recommendations with findings and conclusions? And I think this is a really interesting challenge because I've actually encountered some of the OECD members, they don't make recommendations and they don't do it as the role of evaluators to actually make recommendations. So they stop at presenting findings and conclusions, and then they work with the program people or the policymakers to formulate their own recommendations. That is one way of approaching it, but there's a lot of work and a lot of thinking now about how do you formulate useful recommendations. We say that sometimes the recommendations are like motherhood and apple pie. It's like, oh, you should do more good things and less bad things, which is, of course, somewhat obvious, right? So how do you actually formulate useful recommendations? And I think that speaks to the broader question about useful evaluations overall, which really does require, even as we maintain independence to preserve credibility and avoid bias, we also need to engage with all the stakeholders throughout an evaluation process. So we don't just surprise people at the end with a bunch of findings and recommendations, but they're actually involved in discussing, making sense of the data together. And that can help us formulate recommendations that might actually result in action, which is, of course, the overall goal. So that would be my recommendation on that question. So how to encourage the program designer to include the criteria during the planning phase? This is a great question from Monica. So I think it's all about incentives and about institutional cultures. So we talk about this idea that culture eats systems for breakfast or eats policy for breakfast. So you can have in place lots of policies, but it is also about having a culture that encourages people to learn and to be accountable for the results. What we've seen is that if you have a culture of an institution that's all about hitting funding targets, for example, getting money out the door, then you will have very little attention to results and impact. And I know that was your discussion yesterday. So I think, creating a culture within an institution where you can say, we have some assumptions here about what's going to happen when we create this cash transfer program, for example. If we provide funding to this group of people, we have assumptions about what the impacts will be. But we're willing to challenge those assumptions, and we're going to look for evidence to see whether we are actually achieving the intended goals and whether we might be actually having some unintended effects, such as increasing violence against the beneficiaries of that cash transfer program. So I think it comes to having sort of policies, procedures, manuals in place so that when a program officer sits down to write their business case, they actually have those 6 questions sitting there. And when they present it to the funders or to the parliamentarian or the decision maker who's deciding whether or not we will do this program, they are asked those 6 questions. I think that's really important. Put in place those manuals, those handbooks, training, onboarding training, etc. But then also think about the broader learning culture within an institution. And Asila, I see you have a comment in here. Do you want to, and it looks like you actually just to sort of say what I was thinking as well, which is to encourage parliamentarians to ask the questions, use those questions to ask in the debate. Who is benefiting from this program and to what extent is this a priority for those people? That's a relevance question, right? So really asking those questions at the beginning throughout the evaluation process. And evaluation really, I think, shouldn't just be the job of evaluators, right? It should be everybody's job. And then how do we manage the trade-offs between these categories? Maha, I don't know if you want to come in and ask your question orally, but I think, yeah, that'd be great. Go ahead, Maha.
Sure. So Megan, I was, when you shared that slide with the 6 lenses, right, the 6 colors. So I was just thinking that at times we have to take a decision between one category and the other category. It takes a toll maybe on the other category because these categories are linked. So maybe the project is working well in terms of it is effective, you're using the inputs right and the resources, but maybe it's not sustainable, or maybe it is not coherent with some other policies. So at times, I believe in practical situations, you really have to pick and choose or prioritize which criteria is more important at that time based on the context, because of course, context is super, super important when it comes to this. So how do you really sort of draw a line where you have to pick and choose, or maybe, prioritize one category over the other so that you don't, the project is, running, but it does not, lose out on one aspect greatly. So at times I feel like Dr. Soma's session yesterday, there can be somewhat of an ethical dilemma when we're, using these categories. So
Yeah.
that is basically what I wanted to know.
Yeah, and I think that's a important question to be asking. And of course, I don't have an easy answer for you because they are ethical dilemmas. And that points to the values, the role of values in evaluation. Evaluation is not measurement. It's about actually passing value judgments. And so, an external evaluator can't tell you whether you value the cost per participant reached, or whether you value the fact that you're reaching the most marginalized communities. That is a value judgment. That's a question of priorities. And it's also a question of power. So who's answering those questions, but then who's also making the final judgment? One place we see this very clearly is around efficiency. So we talk about, dollar per life saved or those types of measures. But if we are really trying to leave no one behind and reach really the most marginalized and excluded parts of a population, that's often much more expensive. Just because it's more expensive doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do, right? But that is a value question of whether we're willing to actually go the extra mile to reach the person who's the most excluded, who needs help, or whose rights are not being fulfilled the most. And so I think those are really important points that you've made, Maha, and really important questions to ask. Evaluation is not a technical activity. There are a lot of technical elements of it, but it's fundamentally an issue of values. And that's why we see the word value is in the middle of evaluation.
Thank you for that answer, Megan. So we actually have a little bit more time, and if we can share some cases and some examples of the questions that some of you are sharing in the chat box. So if somebody would like to speak up and share some of the questions that you have formulated using these categories, we would love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you. I think it would be great to hear from people. Maybe give someone a chance to raise their hand and be willing to unmute. That would be great. And I might just touch on this question. There's a question in the chat sort of about the timing. And I think this is a really important question, because when we get down to the technical aspect of applying the criteria, this question of time is very different, or is very challenging. So what we say is that you can ask the evaluation questions or the criteria's questions at any moment in the life cycle. And you can also look through that lens at any moment in a project's life cycle. So we may look at relevance, for example. I'm sitting here 1 year after the program was approved and implemented. And I'm looking back to March of 2020 when this program was approved. And now I'm asking the relevance question. In March of 2020, what did we know about the needs and the priorities of the affected populations? And was it a relevant program at that moment? And I would look for evidence to support answering that question. Then I might look to a different point in time and I might say, okay, what about in December of 2021? Were the needs and priorities different? And was the relevance there or not there anymore? And so this question of sort of timing, we use the same concept and the same questions, but we might look for different types of evidence at different moments. And that's particularly true in terms of impact and sustainability. So if we don't have actual evidence of sustainability, we'll look at, is there a probability? Do we have evidence to support the idea that these changes and benefits will last? So the evidence may change, the way you answer the question may change, but the concept itself stays the same at any moment in time. Do we have a brave person to raise their hand and share an example? We'll have to pick on somebody who put it in. Virgil Pamphil, maybe you would like to come in. I see you put some nice questions in the chat.
Well, I was thinking, yes, thank you very much. I didn't want to interfere. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very valuable, and I appreciate it very much. It's about your exercise. You asked us to think about in 10 minutes about some evaluative questions related to an intervention. And I thought at the Rural Development Program about the an aid program to support the tomato producers. to increase their crops and so forth, and to enter into the market, so forth. And well, I thought about 4 questions to cover the 4 criteria, which I wrote in the chat. So
Yeah. Would you like to share?
well, this
please.
was your task. I mean, I try to comply with your task, to follow your requests. That's all.
Yeah, great. And I think you did a really good job. Were there any that you felt were particularly difficult, or where you found it hard to come up with a question for the intervention?
Well, I'm a fan to these evaluations, and it was just a challenge to adapt in 10 minutes to cover the 4 criteria.
Great, great.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for participating. And it would be interesting someday. We'll hopefully see an evaluation of the tomato program. Do others have questions, or want to jump in and share any reflections on the questions that you came up with? Any that you felt you weren't sure where they fit?
Hi, Megan. I'm Vishwaranjan Braj from India. And thank you for taking this session. It's a great session. I have a question related to efficiency. Since efficiency emphasizes on the economic and timely aspects, how do you see equity to be fitted in, since it will try to emphasize more on the output in less fund within a given time frame? Then how you see the equity aspect can be emphasized on the efficiency aspect? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think the key with efficiency is that efficiency is often sometimes, reduced to a concept of cost, which is actually not what efficiency is about. So efficiency looks at the relative cost to the benefit. And so that's where I think this question of which values, which outcomes and impacts do we most value is really important. And that's where I think equity comes in. So as I said, just because it costs more per, let's say woman's life saved during child labor, it may cost more to reach women that are in vulnerable situations or in excluded communities, historically marginalized communities. It may cost more per woman's life saved. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an inefficient program. We also see contexts where, for example, in countries or in regions where there's a high insecurity in very fragile settings, you will have very high costs associated, or where the infrastructure is very poor. You'll have very high costs associated with delivering even, say, humanitarian aid. That doesn't necessarily mean that those are not efficient interventions. So what we would need to do is really think about what is the appropriate benchmark that we're using to judge the efficiency. So rather than saying, how much does it cost per life saved in this community that we're evaluating the intervention in versus in the capital city in a middle income neighborhood, that's not the correct benchmark to use. So you need to be sure that you're using an appropriate benchmark when you're judging whether or not an intervention is efficient or not. And the same goes for looking at alternatives. It can be very challenging for evaluators if the program itself did not look at alternatives when they were designing it, right? So were there other ways of saving lives that would have been more effective? Maybe we trained midwives, but what we needed to be doing was empowering mothers-in-law to seek support for their laboring daughter-in-law. So those are the types of questions where you really need to look at what's a realistic alternative approach to achieving the same outcome, and what are the costs associated with it. But what we see is that a lot of times the costs are not well documented, even for the inputs, and that makes it very difficult for evaluators to then judge in a reliable way the actual efficiency in terms of outputs or outcomes and impacts. That's again a great question. Yes, Kasun from Kasun Ramanayake.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. And my question is that, especially while we are evaluating the coherent criteria in the projects, I know this is coming from in a macro level, but when we are evaluating in a micro level, small projects, we could see some activity level. Though some of activities affected for positively or negatively for some other things beyond our project. Those effects can be included in the coherent criteria, or it's just come for an impact level or in the outcome level.
Yeah, I think this is one of the real challenges with the coherence criteria. If I've understood your question correctly, it's, the coherence criteria includes so many different dimensions that it could be a very big evaluation to look at all the aspects of coherence. And so what we've seen is that many institutions are now choosing to focus on particular aspects of coherence. Or, for example, that a micro level project, an individual project, maybe you're only going to look at coherence for some major projects, or you're only going to look at coherence for a portfolio of projects, but you're not going to look at it for every single evaluation, precisely because it's quite difficult to ask all the questions of coherence that one might have. It's also a good example of where it's difficult if the people who design an intervention didn't look at coherence. It can be very difficult then for the evaluators to recreate and say, okay, what else is taking place in this space or in this community, against which we should be looking at coordination or looking at questions of overlap and value add.
Thank you very much.
So, Megan, I have another question for you. So you shared that some of the countries have translated the OECD DAC criteria. So I would really like to, and I think it will be really good to, and motivating actually, for the audience to basically hear what sort of advantage or what was like the success story. Maybe if you can share some success story of how well it was received or how it was well utilized when a country translated and then used the DAC criteria. So maybe if you can share a story, that would be great.
Great. I feel like I should let you tell that story, actually. You probably have the best example. So what we've seen is that, of course, these translations they're partnerships. And so there's a reason we don't just hire a translator to write the document in a language. It's actually through the process of discussing and debating the concepts and what the meaning is within a language that we've seen the criteria become really useful and embedded. And I'd say where we've seen the greatest success is where the evaluation criteria are actually embedded into national laws. For example, Kenya recently passed its public policy evaluation law and that policy, and that includes a reference to the definition of evaluation, which includes the criteria. Philippines and Nepal both also have national directives or regulations that include the criteria. But I think Pakistan is a great example where in partnership with the government, but then also the Pakistan Youth Network and the VOPEs, there has been a lot of support to actually looking at how to roll out the criteria through line ministries and subnational governments. And I think that's when it starts to get a lot more meaningful, is when the criteria come to life within institutions. So within training manuals, within material for bringing new staff on board, they become sort of the heart and the second nature of everybody working in an institution. That's where we've seen some value. And it's not easy because sometimes, amongst our members, OECD members, for example, in Swedish, there's no distinction between effectiveness and impact. The language does not suit itself well to that. So the Swedish colleagues have had to come up with a new way of conveying those evaluative questions that worked best in their local community. So I think, it's a little known fact that even amongst our own members, we at the OECD don't have the means to impose the criteria on anyone, but really it's a demand-driven process through which they're being taken up by different partners. Yeah, and please feel free to complement that, Maha.
Absolutely, and I think this is actually quite powerful because with the translations at times, sometimes the meanings change because the context is so different, but this criteria is broad enough that it can accommodate these contextual situations and changes. So in that terms, it's really good that it accommodates everyone and is not so strict or just does not put everyone in one box. So you can adopt it the way you want. So it is still in a way standardizing, but at the same time gives you room for improvement and room to adopt it according to your country's context. So I feel that is really, really something great about it. So I think we just have time to take one more question. And just a heads up before we take that question, we are going to take the group picture so after the session, we're going to take the group picture. So stay with us. So yes, one last question. So Novi, your mic's open. Temura, you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute your mic?
Diminta perwakilan.
May I ask or?
I've not heard you. Yes, go ahead now.
Okay. My question was just I wrote it in the chat box that I observed in some organizations, international organizations, they call us to evaluate the project. Then we address that your project or their project is somewhat failed to address the issue, but they tell us that, oh, we are focusing on the lesson learned, and they want to cover their failure with the lesson learned. What do you think, or what is your advice as a senior? Back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most challenging issues I think that evaluators face. I've also had that experience myself where when you presented the evaluation terms of reference, the people involved in the program said, you know, under effectiveness, we asked, you know, did you achieve this objective? I said, oh, but where have you come up with this objective? I said, well, that's actually what you said. You yourself said you were going to do, and maybe they've set very unrealistic objectives. And so then there's a lot of pain that people experience when you actually say, you know, you really did not achieve the objectives that you set out to achieve. So that's where I think it's really important to be empathetic and to also recognize that while we say it's important to fail and to fail fast or to learn lessons, yes, of course, we want to emphasize lesson learning, not just blaming people for ineffective projects, but we're all human. And most of our cultures do not lend themselves well to being able to admit actually when we have not succeeded. And you see that oftentimes that those types of very difficult messages sometimes don't make it into a final evaluation report, but they may be discussed in other forums or in ways that are more acceptable, that people feel willing to actually really ask those questions. I think it's also important for evaluators to not stop at a surface level, but to use tools such as the 5 whys, where you keep saying, okay, so this intervention didn't achieve its goals. Well, why? And then keep asking why until you really uncover, you know, it's probably not because there was a person with bad intentions who, you know, intentionally undermined or did something wrong. There were probably other drivers or systemic drivers to why something went wrong. So that can also help depersonalize those kinds of findings and make people a bit more open to hearing those difficult messages. But yes, I think this is a real question for institutions, especially in contexts where you have funding dynamics. So a lot of funders say they want to see their grantees learning, but when it comes down to it, are you actually willing to accept that maybe you have negative results and to say, you know what, we tried that, we thought it would work, it didn't work, that's okay. We're going to move on, we're going to try to change and do something different. So, you know, what we say is the worst kind of failures are the failures that you don't realize you're making. So I do like that idea that your partners or your counterparts are trying to focus on lesson learning. But it is a really difficult issue to overcome. And I think just being humble and bringing our own sort of human empathy and understanding is really important. I mentioned briefly the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition. And in the context of evaluating during the pandemic, that has been a real challenge. Is to not pay, you know, a lot of people are under a huge amount of pressure with the pandemic. So to have some sympathy towards people and say, you know, people are doing the best they can in difficult circumstances. And at the same time say and we need people to do better. You know, we all need to be doing better on these issues. So that's a difficult challenge to manage, but I think I appreciate your question a lot. And I feel a lot of empathy for you in managing that and trying to find ways that you could maybe support the lesson learning while also not turning a blind eye to maybe failures or ineffectiveness.
Thank you so much, Megan. This was brilliant. This was such a detailed session on the
Thank you.
OECD DAC criteria.